long before the rivers froze in their deep sleep and before the forests whispered only to themselves, there was a man whose name the winds almost remembered. He came from no royal line, no noble house, and yet he would carve a place in the memory of the wild, though few ever saw him. In chronicles that never were, he is called simply the Northman, a solitary figure who chose a life so distant from human eyes that 40 winters passed before he was known to any who might have spoken of him. It is said he left the villages one spring morning, when the snow had softened to mud and the birches quivered in the thaw. No bell told his departure, no farewell echoed through the meadows. He walked north, guided by instinct and the quiet pull of the untamed lands, where the sun hung low for much of the year and the nights stretched long as a monk's contemplation. Those who glimpsed him later swore he moved like a shadow, either hurried nor weary, yet always persistent, leaving only faint footprints for the bears or the wind to trace. The journey was not made in haste, nor in search of gold or conquest. Instead, it seemed that the Northman was drawn by the silence itself, by the way the trees listened and the rivers murmured secrets too delicate for human ears. He carried little, a crude pack with essentials, perhaps a knife forged in a forgotten village, and an old cloak that had been his father's. Beyond that, he bore only his curiosity and a longing for a life unfettered by the affairs of men. Villagers told tales of the forests he passed, and though the stories were whispered as warnings to children, they hinted at a man who conversed with the wilderness. Birds would settle near him, wolves would observe from a distance, and the land seemed to part gently as he walked. Some chroniclers, if we may call them so, insisted that he spoke softly to the snow, thanking it for the cover it gave him in the deepest winters, and to the sun, praising its brief warmth in midsummer. Others believed he had vanished entirely into myth, leaving only footprints and a faint trail of smoke from fires that appeared and disappeared like mirages. In the first winter he spent alone, he built a small shelter of fallen timber, nestled against a rocky hill. The walls were simple, the roof thatched with reeds and branches, yet they were sufficient against the biting wind. Here he learned the language of survival, how to read the drift of snow, how to follow the signs left by deer and moose, how to trap fish beneath the ice without making a sound that might disturb the forest itself. His days were long, quiet, measured by the sun's slow crawl across the horizon, and his nights were longer still, punctuated by the aurora's ethereal glow and the distant howl of wolves. And yet, even in solitude, he was not entirely alone. The land itself became companion. The river murmured of events far away, of men and their petty quarrels, of kingdoms rising and falling like fleeting snowstorms. The trees held him gently in their shadow, and the mountains offered a silent counsel that he came to understand. Time passed differently here. There were no calendars, no clerks, no market cries. There was only the rhythm of life that the Northman followed, patiently, day by day, season by season. As spring returned the following year, the snow melted into soft streams and the forest bloomed with life anew. He moved with it, gathering what the land could give, crafting what he could not find. The Northman's presence became a part of the wilderness, as if he were a root among roots, a stone among stones, unremarkable yet indispensable in its quiet persistence. And though he remained unseen by human eyes, his legend began to grow, whispered in the northern villages by those few who dared wander close enough to glimpse a solitary figure moving through the trees, pale against the white, his eyes reflecting a knowledge no town could offer. By the second winter, the story of the Northman had passed beyond villages. Hunters spoke of him in hushed tones, elders nodded knowingly when asked if he existed, and children imagined him as part spirit, part man, entirely at one with the frozen expanse. And though the villagers wondered what drove him to such extreme isolation, the answer was simple, though unfathomable to those bound by walls and commerce. He sought a world untouched, a life unmeasured, and the slow, unbroken cadence of a 40-year solitude yet to come. As the first snows of the third winter settled on his small timbered home, the Northman looked out across the frozen river, tracing the patterns the ice made as if they were letters in an ancient, unreadable script. There, in the quiet that had become his only companion, he understood something that the crowded halls of men could never teach: that life, stripped of human distractions, offered clarity, and that the wild, in all its cruelty and beauty, could be as faithful a teacher as any master. And so, as the wind whistled across the ridges and the moon cast silver shadows upon the snow, the Northman continued his silent life, unaware of how many years would pass before his story would touch any human ears again, and yet certain that this was the life he was meant to lead. And as the snow deepened and the forest held its breath, another winter approached, carrying with it challenges that would test not just his body, but the spirit that sought communion with the untamed north. As the first snow of that third winter settled across the hills and valleys, the Northman found himself deeper within the heart of the northern wilderness than ever before. The frozen river, now a silver ribbon under the pale moonlight, guided his steps, yet he no longer followed its curves as a traveler seeking a path. Instead, he let it lead him where the land willed, allowing instinct and the quiet rhythm of the wild to dictate his movements. Every branch, every whisper of the wind, seemed to carry messages, soft hints of prey, warnings of approaching storms, or merely the subtle music of a world untouched by human hands. The forests were alive in ways that villages could never comprehend. The birches shivered under the weight of frost, their slender trunks bending as though bowing in silent salute to the lone man who had chosen their company. Pines exhaled the scent of resin and cold sap, and the needles muffled his footsteps, allowing him to move as though gliding across the earth itself. It was here, among the trees that whispered to one another in a language older than any chronicle, that the Northman began to feel a profound connection, a quiet understanding that he was part of a story far grander than his own, one written in snowdrifts and the shimmer of frost-laden leaves. Hunger and cold were constant companions, though he rarely thought of them as burdens. In these northern lands, survival was a conversation with the elements. He learned where the deer might wander beneath the shadow of ancient oaks, where the beaver dens could provide sustenance in a pinch, and which berries endured the frost long enough to nourish him through the long nights. Each discovery was a small triumph, yet he celebrated them not with outward joy, but with a silent gratitude, whispered into the wind, as if nature itself deserved acknowledgment for its generosity. At night, the forest seemed to breathe around him. The creaking of branches, the sigh of the river, and the distant cry of owls formed a symphony so subtle that any human ears accustomed to the cacophony of villages would scarcely notice it. Yet to the Northman, these sounds were the pulse of life itself, a rhythm he came to measure by more faithfully than any sundial or clock. Hours stretched and folded like the drifts of snow, days melted into nights with only the faintest distinctions, marked by the position of the moon or the brightness of stars reflected on the icy ground. He built additional shelters, small caches hidden among the trees, each one designed to blend seamlessly with its surroundings. Twigs and moss disguised their presence, and bark peeled carefully from fallen logs to reinforce walls without harming the trees themselves. Over time, the forest became not merely a place he wandered, but a vast, living home, a labyrinth of trees, rocks, and frozen streams in which he moved with confidence born of intimate knowledge. But the forest was not always forgiving. Sudden storms would whip the branches into flailing arms, or drifts of snow would swallow the tracks he had so carefully laid. Wolves, curious and cautious, would watch him from a distance, their eyes glinting like lanterns in the dark. He learned to respect them, to avoid startling them, and sometimes, in moments of rare closeness, he would sense their acknowledgment, a silent nod of coexistence. In such moments the Northman felt neither fear nor triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of understanding the unspoken rules of the land. It was during one particularly harsh storm, with snow lashing his face and the wind slicing across the hills, that he made a discovery: a hollowed log deep in the forest, warm with the faint residue of a fire long cold. Inside, he found traces of another wanderer, someone who had passed before him and left nothing more than a few carved symbols on the walls. He did not understand them entirely, yet he felt their intention, a mark of presence, a whisper from a human soul reaching across the years. And in that instant, he recognized something he had not yet admitted to himself. Though he had sought absolute solitude, he longed, faintly, for the presence of another, a spirit aligned in quiet observation rather than conversation. Even so, he remained alone. Winter continued its slow, relentless march, and the forest became both teacher and companion. The Northman's movements were now measured by the migration of birds, the formation of ice on the river, and the subtle shifts of the stars above. He learned to read the snow not merely for tracks of prey, but for its story, where winds had fallen hardest, where wolves had wandered, where the earth beneath might give way or remain steadfast. The land spoke constantly, and he listened with an attentiveness that would have seemed unnatural to any human who dwelled within walls and markets. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the sky blushed with faint pink and orange, he would pause at the edge of the frozen river, tracing the lines carved by wind and frost. And as he traced them, he thought not of himself, nor of the village left far behind, but of the forest, and of the seasons, and of the delicate, inexorable rhythm that governed every living thing. It was a rhythm both merciless and generous, and he had learned to yield to it without complaint or resistance. Thus, the Northman's days stretched into months, and his months into years. Each winter was a mirror of the last, yet each carried subtle differences: a new path through the forest, an unfamiliar animal passing nearby, a branch fallen differently across a familiar trail. And so, as the second winter of his isolation waned, he moved with a certainty that only comes from profound communion with one's surroundings. He was no longer merely a man wandering through the forest. He had become a part of it, a single breath in the vast, whispering body of the north. And as the snow softened under the tentative sun of early spring, the Northman would discover that even the quietest corners of the forest held secrets darker than the longest night, secrets that would test his solitude and forge the spirit that could endure 40 winters. Spring's gentle thaw revealed the forest anew, each tree dripping with the memory of snow, each brook gurgling softly as it reclaimed its frozen channels. The Northman moved carefully, his boots leaving impressions that would soon vanish under fresh moss or soft rain, for in these northern woods, permanence was a fleeting illusion. Yet, as he ventured farther into the heart of the forest, he became aware of subtle disturbances, shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should, the faint rustle of leaves without wind, the distant cracking of branches where no animal had trod. At first, he told himself these were tricks of imagination, the mind conjuring movement in a world where his solitude had sharpened every sense. But slowly, he came to understand that the forest itself held another presence, one that watched, and listened, and waited. It was not malevolent, not in the way of men, but it was deliberate, a reminder that even in isolation, one is never entirely alone. The Northman began to notice the tracks, not the prints of deer or wolf, but patterns in the earth that hinted at the movement of someone, or something, more deliberate, more measured. He followed the subtle traces, not with pursuit, but with curiosity, as though approaching a fellow scholar in a long-forgotten library. Days passed, and he found evidence of small fires, carefully concealed, of simple tools laid upon flat stones, and carvings upon the bark of ancient pines. Symbols, he thought, left by another hand, a hand that perhaps sought understanding, much like his own. The forest, which had once seemed only a teacher, now became a companion in dialogue, its secrets teasing and coaxing him toward discovery. At night, when the stars reflected upon the icy pools and the wind whispered through the branches, the Northmen pondered the meaning of these signs. Could there be another soul dwelling so deeply within these woods, so attuned to their rhythm, that they had gone unnoticed for decades? He imagined the other, silent, deliberate, moving through the underbrush with as much reverence as he himself had learned to hold. And though he never saw this figure, he felt a connection, a quiet acknowledgement that both were bound by a singular pursuit, communion with the land, and the unbroken solitude it demanded. Yet solitude, even the deliberate kind, is a fragile thing. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest bathed in the last amber light, he glimpsed movement, a figure stepping softly through the pines. Not a shadow, not a trick of the eye, but a human shape, tall and deliberate, halting for a moment to observe him as much as he observed it. Their eyes did not meet, for both knew the fragile etiquette of such encounters: acknowledgement without intrusion, recognition without disruption. The Northman's heart, unaccustomed to the presence of another, felt a ripple, an echo of humanity he had long set aside. The figure disappeared into the depths of the forest, leaving behind only the faintest trace, a circle of disturbed leaves, the scent of smoke on the air, and the faint indentation of a boot pressed lightly into the moss. The Northman knelt to examine it, tracing the impression with his fingers. There was no fear, only fascination. In that moment, he understood that the forest had layers beyond comprehension, and that even in the 40 years of his chosen isolation, he would encounter mysteries that tested his patience, his understanding, and his connection to the land itself. Winter returned with its quiet rigor, pressing cold fingers into every crevice of the forest. Yet the Northman moved with the confidence of one who had learned the language of snow and stone, of frost and shadow. Each step was deliberate, each decision measured against the subtle cues of the wilderness. The presence he had glimpsed lingered in his mind like a half-remembered dream, guiding him without intrusion, reminding him that the forest's lessons were endless, and that solitude was as much a state of mind as a matter of distance. Over time, the Northman began to anticipate the rhythms of this hidden companion. He noticed where birds took sudden flight, where deer hesitated on familiar trails, where the wind shifted to carry scents from beyond his immediate surroundings. The forest, which had once been his sole interlocutor, now seemed to have an unseen ally, a guardian, a reflection of his own respect for the untamed world. He did not seek confrontation, nor did he attempt communication. Instead, he allowed the shadows to play their quiet game, learning, always learning, from the intricate balance between presence and absence. And so the seasons turned. Snow thawed and fell, rivers swelled and receded, and the Northman moved ever deeper into the forest, following its silent counsel. He built new shelters, hidden beneath the sheltering arms of ancient pines, crafted with care so that neither wind nor rain might betray their location. Each day brought subtle revelations, a hollow filled with winter birds, a cave carved by water over centuries, a patch of mushrooms that only appeared after the first thaw. The forest itself had become both teacher and confidant, revealing its most intimate secrets only to the patient observer. By the third winter, the Northman had learned an unspoken truth: the forest was alive not merely with animals and trees, but with layers of memory and presence that stretched far beyond his comprehension. The shadows among the pines, once a source of intrigue and slight unease, had become markers of this unseen order, guiding him through the wilderness as he honed a life entirely attuned to the rhythms of a world untouched by human folly. And though the 40 years of solitude stretched ahead like a distant horizon, he felt, for the first time, that solitude did not mean loneliness. It meant alignment, a union with the land that required patience, reverence, and an understanding deeper than words could convey. And as the Northman settled beside a hidden brook beneath the pines, the whispers of the forest hinted at a trial yet to come, a test of endurance and spirit that would stretch the limits of his solitude and shape the man who would endure 40 winters alone. The forest's quiet vigil continued, yet the Northman soon discovered that even the most patient communion with the wild could not shield him from the raw, unrelenting force of winter. As the first frosts hardened the ground and frost-laden winds swept down from the distant mountains, he understood that the wilderness held tests far harsher than isolation alone. The snow arrived in relentless sheets, veiling familiar paths, folding the landscape into a blinding, unbroken whiteness, and turning even the smallest task into a challenge that demanded every ounce of skill and endurance he had cultivated. He fortified his shelters, stacking branches and boughs with meticulous care, weaving moss and reeds to resist the sharp intrusion of icy gusts. Fires became central to his survival, not merely for warmth, but for guidance, a point of reference in a landscape that threatened to swallow him into uniformity and silence. Smoke curled into the sky, a thin thread of defiance against the white expanse, and through it, he felt a connection to the small, vital fires that humans had tended since time immemorial. It was a ritual of presence, tending flame, securing shelter, gathering food, small, deliberate acts that affirmed life in a world that seemed poised to reclaim him. The Northman hunted with the patience of centuries condensed into singular moments. He read the tracks of wolves, the drag of moose hooves through soft snow, the scattering of birds startled by some hidden motion. Each discovery required delicacy, each meal demanded reverence. In these quiet encounters, he observed the balance of life and death, the subtle orchestration of survival. Nothing was wasted, nothing taken lightly, and the lessons of each encounter with the wild became as crucial as any he had learned in the earlier years of solitude. But winter was not merely a teacher of patience, it was a sculptor of endurance. Blizzards arose without warning, masking the forest in a blinding fury. The wind tore across frozen rivers and high ridges, snapping branches, overturning his careful shelters, and threatening to erase all traces of his labor. In those long nights, as snow piled against the timber walls and the trees groaned under the weight of frost, he learned the limits of his own resolve. Every gust that shook his shelter, every creaking limb that threatened to collapse upon him, was a whisper of caution from the land itself, a reminder that no man, however attuned, could command the wilderness. Yet, in these trials, there was also revelation. The Northman began to see the subtle patterns of the storms, the ways the wind shifted, the angle at which snow accumulated against rock and tree. He observed how certain hollows offered protection, how certain ridges captured the warmth of sunlight even in the depth of frost. Survival became more than a matter of instinct, it became an art, a dialogue with the world itself. Each challenge honed his senses, each hardship refined his patience, each gust of wind strengthened his resolve to endure. In the midst of the harshest blizzard, he found a hidden grove, encircled by ancient pines that shielded the snowdrifts, leaving the floor bare and the air relatively still. Here he constructed a temporary shelter, weaving branches and fallen bark into a lattice strong enough to resist the assault of wind. Within this fragile sanctuary, he huddled beside the fire, listening to the storm's fury and finding solace in the rhythm of survival. The storm was both threat and teacher, and the Northman learned to read its moods with a subtlety that would have astonished any village elder. Food became scarce as the weeks of frost accumulated. He relied on caches he had prepared in warmer months, on the frozen bodies of river fish trapped beneath the ice, and on the patience that guided his hunting. Even the smallest successes were celebrated quietly, the satisfaction not expressed in triumph but in survival, in the quiet knowledge that the rhythms of the world had been respected, and he had endured. The nights stretched long, endless, interrupted only by the faint aurora that shimmered across the sky. In those hours he reflected on the solitude he had chosen, the life he had carved from the wilderness, and the depth of patience required to live in alignment with the land. The forest was no longer merely a place to exist. It was a canvas, a vast, breathing entity that molded him, tested him, and ultimately became inseparable from his own being. It was during one of these prolonged storms that he understood something essential. The forest did not merely demand endurance, it offered a mirror. In the unbroken white of snow and the unyielding cold of frost, he saw the limits of his own strength, the quiet capacity of his spirit, and the unfathomable patience required to live entirely alone, yet entirely within the world. The trial of the winter was not merely survival, it was transformation. As the blizzard finally eased, leaving the forest sparkling under a brittle sun, the Northman emerged with a renewed understanding of his place in the wilderness. Each tree, each rock, each frozen stream had taught him the subtle art of patience, the quiet discipline of solitude, and the endurance that would sustain him for decades yet to come. Though the storm had tested him to his limits, it had also solidified the foundation of a life that would last 40 winters. And as the forest settled into the brittle calm that follows every storm, the Northman would face a new kind of challenge, subtler yet no less formidable. The loneliness that seeps into the mind, the weight of years measured in silence, and the slow, creeping passage of time in a world that forgets all but the patient. After the storm had passed, leaving the forest glazed with ice and sparkling beneath a pale sun, the Northman felt a subtle shift in the rhythm of his days. The trial of the winter had tested his body, but now he sensed the slow, pressing weight of silence upon his mind. In the villages he had left behind, even the simplest sounds, bells, the murmur of markets, the laughter of children, had marked the passage of time and connected him to others. Here, in the endless expanse of snow and pines, time moved differently, measured not by hours or days, but by the subtle movements of frost along branches, the drifting of clouds, the flicker of the northern lights across a dark sky. Solitude was a companion, patient and constant, yet it carried its own lessons. The forest spoke in whispers, in the rustle of branches and the crunch of snow underfoot, but it lacked the familiar cadence of human speech. For the first time, he became aware of the ache that comes from hearing nothing but one's own thoughts, and the distant murmur of wind. Days stretched long, and nights endless. It was not loneliness in the usual sense. There were the tracks of animals, the call of birds, the shifting clouds overhead, but a quiet, pressing awareness that he was utterly removed from all human eyes, all human voices, all human concern. He began to mark time not with fire or sun, but with ritual. Each morning, he would wander the forest, checking his shelters, clearing snow from caches, noting the patterns of animal tracks. Each evening, he tended his fires carefully, stacking branches so that the flames would endure, watching the sparks rise and vanish into the night. These acts, though simple, became anchors against the vast emptiness of his environment. And in performing them, he discovered an unexpected solace. The mind, disciplined and attentive, could find meaning even in a world that offered no human acknowledgement. Yet silence has a way of amplifying thought. Memories from long ago, faces of people he had barely known, the fading echoes of village life, began to surface with uncanny clarity. He would remember a child laughing by a brook, the creaking of a cart on cobblestone streets, the warmth of a hearth where strangers once gathered. Such recollections brought no bitterness, only a strange tenderness, a recognition that life, once lived with others, could not simply be erased. The forest listened patiently as he recalled these fleeting moments, neither mocking nor comforting, simply present as a witness to his introspection. Over time, he found that silence could also teach subtle skills. By listening to the wind in the branches, he learned to anticipate storms before they arrived, to find hidden passages in the snow, to predict where game would gather or retreat. The forest became a kind of tutor, its lessons quiet and unhurried, revealing truths that human instruction could never impart. And in these lessons, he found a growing awareness of his own resilience, a sense of accomplishment measured not in recognition or praise, but in the simple fact of continued existence. Evenings were the hardest. The sun dipped low, and shadows lengthened across the snow, drawing the world into dim, indistinct shapes. He would sit beside the fire, watching smoke rise in delicate spirals, imagining the lives of those he had left behind, wondering if they thought of him at all. Yet even in these moments, he discovered a strange beauty, the realization that existence, stripped of human interference, carried a clarity and purity impossible to find in crowded halls or bustling markets. Silence, he understood, was both a weight and a gift, a crucible in which the mind could be tempered, sharpened, and expanded. Occasionally, he would venture to the frozen river, tracing the line where ice met water, and watch the slow drift of flakes across its surface. He felt the passage of time not as a burden, but as a companion, measured in the subtle changes of the world rather than by calendars or clocks. Days, months, and years became a sequence of small, deliberate observations, a bird returning to the same branch, a thaw revealing new tracks, the slow thickening of frost on distant ridges. Each detail, when observed attentively, offered connection, grounding him in the unbroken continuity of life. As the second winter in succession yielded to a brief, luminous spring, the Northman realized that his solitude had transformed him. He no longer merely survived, he existed in harmony with the wilderness, attuned to rhythms and patterns that no human could comprehend fully. Yet the weight of silence persisted, a reminder that his life, extraordinary though it might become, was entirely removed from the world of men. He would endure not for recognition, nor for glory, but for the subtle, profound satisfaction of being wholly present in the forest and wholly subject to its timeless laws. And as the days lengthened and the river's edge shimmered with the first melt, he felt, for the first time, the subtle stirrings of a deeper challenge, an encounter not of body, nor of immediate danger, but of spirit. The silence that had been his teacher was beginning to speak in ways that demanded reflection, courage, and a patience that only decades could cultivate. The forest was preparing him, as it had all along, for trials that were unseen, yet as formidable as any blizzard or predator. And so, beneath the long shadows of towering pines, the Northman would soon confront a test not of survival, but of endurance in the mind and spirit, a trial that would shape the man who would endure 40 winters in solitude. Spring's thaw had softened the forest, revealing contours that winter had concealed, and it was during one such moment of careful exploration that the Northman stumbled upon what he would come to regard as the forest's most intimate secret, a hidden passage, veiled by moss and shadow, curling beneath a ridge where no animal tracks appeared. At first, he hesitated, feeling the familiar caution that had been honed by years in the wild. Yet curiosity, that quiet spark that had guided him north decades before, compelled him forward. The passage was narrow, carved either by water over centuries or perhaps by the unseen hand of some earlier wanderer. Its entrance was framed by gnarled roots and the dripping fronds of moss, almost as if the forest had conspired to keep it secret. Inside, the air was cooler, damp with the scent of earth and ancient wood. Each step he took echoed softly, a reminder that sound, though muted, was never entirely absent, and that solitude could be punctuated by the faintest reverberations of the past. He followed the passage with deliberate care. The walls were uneven, rough with stone and root, yet they bore subtle markings, small scratches, patterns that suggested human presence, though how long ago or by whom remained a mystery. It was as if the forest had chosen to share a fragment of itself, a corridor leading from one part of its vastness to another, unseen and untouched by ordinary wanderers. In the quiet dimness, he felt the pulse of centuries, the slow accumulation of time and presence, pressing gently against his consciousness. For hours he moved, guided by instinct and the soft trickle of underground water, until the passage widened, opening into a cavern lit by a shaft of sunlight that filtered through a crack above. Here, the world seemed suspended between earth and sky, between shadow and light. The Northman paused to rest, observing the intricate web of roots descending from the ceiling, the faint moss carpeting the floor, and the quiet symphony of dripping water. The cavern was a sanctuary unlike any he had known, a place where the forest itself seemed to breathe around him. He spent days exploring the hidden passage, mapping its twists and turns in his mind, noting where the stone walls curved and where water had carved channels through the rock. Here, he discovered pockets of life that winter had concealed, small pools of fish, clusters of mushrooms thriving in the damp shade, and the delicate footprints of animals that had found refuge in this secret space. The passage offered not merely shelter, but a profound lesson in the persistence of life, even in places humans rarely tread. As the weeks passed, the Northman began to understand that the hidden passage was more than a refuge. It was a mirror of his own life. Just as he had navigated decades of solitude, enduring storms and scarcity, so too did the passage bend and turn, demanding patience, attentiveness, and careful thought. There were points where it narrowed to a mere crawl, moments where progress required caution, and chambers where the darkness pressed in so thoroughly that one's own breath became the only companion. Yet for every challenge, there was reward, light breaking through cracks, the sudden curve of water-sculpted stone, and the quiet knowledge that perseverance revealed treasures hidden from those unwilling to endure. It was here, in the heart of this secret space, that the Northman reflected upon the deeper meaning of his isolation. The 40 years he had chosen, once conceived as a retreat from human folly, now revealed themselves as preparation, a meticulous shaping of character and spirit. The hidden passage was a microcosm of the forest, a labyrinth demanding respect, patience, and reverence. And in its twisting corridors, he sensed the presence of history itself, the accumulated acts of those who had walked before, silent and unseen, their influence lingering in every groove and mark upon the stone. Night fell within the cavern, the shafts of light replaced by the cool glow of moonlight filtering faintly through the cracks above. The Northman made a small fire, careful to contain it, watching the smoke curl upward and mingle with the damp air. In that suspended darkness, he felt both the vastness of the world and the intimacy of the moment. He was utterly alone, yet connected to the forest, to history, and to the quiet pulse of life that had persisted long before his arrival and would endure long after his departure. Emerging from the passage each day, he carried with him the lessons of patience and observation, understanding that survival was as much about perception as it was about action. The hidden corridor, secret and silent, had become a teacher of subtlety, offering insight into the ways the forest held its own wisdom, and how a single man might navigate its complexities without disrupting its delicate balance. And so, as spring deepened into summer, the Northman moved between the sunlit forest and the cool refuge of the hidden passage, each journey reinforcing his attunement to the land. He began to see patterns where before there had been only randomness, the flow of water, the migration of birds, the alignment of trees that hinted at hidden clearings or concealed streams. In these discoveries, he found a quiet affirmation that the forest rewarded patience, respect, and enduring attention. And as he emerged from the passage into the bright canopy above, he sensed that his solitude, though fortified by the wilderness, would soon be challenged not by storms or shadows, but by the subtle stirrings of change within himself, a realization that would test the depth of his resolve and the patience of 40 winters. As the days lengthened and the snow of early spring fully receded into streams and moss, the Northman began to sense a subtle change in the rhythm of the forest. He had grown accustomed to the soft, deliberate murmurs of trees, the distant call of birds, the gentle drip of water from sun-warmed branches. Yet now, a new presence seemed to ripple through the air, a vibration almost imperceptible, like a note held too long in a vast hall. It was not wind, nor animal, nor storm. It was the faint trace of another intelligence moving within the woods. He first noticed it one morning, as he traced the banks of a narrow brook. The snow melt had carved rivulets through the moss, and the sun glinted on water with a brilliance that almost hurt his eyes. A shadow shifted across the pale light, fleeting and delicate, as if the forest itself had breathed it into existence. He froze, listening to the faint disturbance, the snap of a twig, the soft brush of leaves. For a heartbeat, he felt the old, familiar pulse of fear, long dormant, and then curiosity settled in its place, steady and deliberate. The Northman followed the subtle traces, careful not to disturb their origin. The signs were slight, footprints pressed lightly into damp earth, the hint of smoke curling from a distant clearing, the deliberate breakage of a small branch. Whoever, or whatever, moved through these woods did so with attention, with reverence, and with a quiet skill that mirrored his own. It was not an intrusion, it was a meeting of minds separated by circumstance and yet aligned in instinct. Days passed in this silent pursuit. The forest seemed to adjust around him, revealing hidden paths, quiet hollows, and vantage points where he could observe without being observed. And then, as the sun dipped low one evening, he saw them, another human, cloaked in furs, moving with the same deliberate care he had learned over decades. The figure paused, as though aware of his gaze, and for a brief moment, they simply regarded one another across the stretch of forest. No words were spoken. None were necessary. Recognition passed between them, subtle, almost ceremonial, an acknowledgement that both had learned the language of silence and the art of patience. The Northman did not approach, nor did the stranger. Instead, they moved with an unspoken choreography, one advancing slightly, the other retreating, both aware that the forest demanded restraint. Yet, in that quiet encounter, the Northman felt a stir he had not experienced in years, a faint reminder of what it meant to share space with another human being, even without conversation. His heart, long tempered by solitude, beat with measured curiosity rather than longing or fear. Over the following weeks, the encounters continued, always subtle, always fleeting. Tracks would appear where none had been, smoke would curl from hidden clearings, distant movements would hint at an intelligence both familiar and foreign. The forest, which had been his teacher and companion, now became a stage for these delicate interactions, testing his patience and reinforcing his understanding of presence and absence. He began to anticipate the figure's movements, noting patterns, learning to read signs that would have gone unnoticed to any other observer. And yet, the Northman remained cautious. The 40 winters of solitude had taught him the delicate balance between curiosity and prudence. He understood that intimacy with the land demanded humility, and the intrusion of another presence, even one as respectful as this, required the same patience and reverence. The forest had always been a mirror, reflecting his skills, his limitations, and his endurance. Now it reflected the subtle complexity of human connection, hinting at lessons not found in firewood or frozen rivers. As the first summer flowers blossomed, painting the forest floor in muted yellows and delicate whites, the Northman recognized a quiet truth. Solitude was not merely the absence of others, but the cultivation of harmony with both the land and the self. Yet the presence of another reminded him that even in the deepest isolation, the world remained populated with echoes of life, and that connection, however fleeting or subtle, could enrich the spirit without diminishing the integrity of solitude. The first encounter had passed without word, without touch, yet it lingered like a delicate fragrance, a whisper upon the wind. And as the Northman settled beside his fire that evening, watching smoke rise in slow spirals, he realized that the 40 winters of solitude would not be a simple march of seasons and survival. They would also be a journey of understanding, of patience, observation, and the recognition that even the wildest man, alone in the northern reaches, could encounter the quiet presence of another, without disrupting the fragile harmony he had so carefully cultivated. And as twilight deepened among the pines, the forest seemed to hold its breath, preparing for subtler tests yet to come, trials not of fire or frost, but of trust, patience, and the quiet negotiation of companionship in a world built for solitude. Summer lingered in the northern forest, each day stretching with golden light and gentle warmth that contrasted sharply with the long, merciless winters. The Northman moved through the trees with the same deliberate care as always, yet now his solitude was punctuated by the subtle traces of another presence. He had not seen the figure directly in days, yet the forest carried their mark, a carefully arranged pile of stones, the faint imprint of fur-lined boots, the soft curl of smoke rising from hidden hollows. These quiet signals became part of his daily observation, reminders that the world was never as empty as it might seem. The forest itself seemed to acknowledge these subtle interactions. Birds settled differently, pausing in midair to observe his movements. Squirrels and smaller animals seemed more watchful, as if aware that some other intelligence threaded through the woods alongside him. Even the wind shifted in unexpected ways, carrying scents and whispers that hinted at both continuity and change. In these moments, the Northman understood that the wilderness was not merely a backdrop for his life, but a living, attentive participant, capable of guiding, cautioning, and revealing truths too subtle for human perception alone. He began to contemplate the meaning of presence and absence in a new way. For decades he had understood solitude as the removal of human interference, the quiet communion with trees, rivers, and mountains. Yet now, the forest suggested that solitude was not the absence of others, but the discernment of how to move among them without disturbing the delicate equilibrium. The figure he had glimpsed, or perhaps imagined, though the signs suggested otherwise, was neither threat nor companion in the usual sense. Instead, it was a shadow teacher, a subtle reflection of his own patience, endurance, and attentiveness. The Northman sought counsel from the forest in all things. He would wander to the river bank and watch the flow of water, learning the currents and predicting the rise of snow melt. He would listen to the creak of ancient pines, noting which branches might fall or shelter nesting birds. He would pause beside hollow logs, observing how small creatures navigated their hidden world. Each observation, each careful act, reinforced the notion that survival was as much about understanding the living order of the forest as it was about fire, food, or shelter. In these reflective hours, he thought often of the hidden passage he had discovered the previous spring. That secret corridor, with its twisting walls and quiet pools, had taught him patience, discretion, and the subtle joy of discovery. Now, he realized, the forest itself was a far larger passage, guiding him toward understanding not only of survival but of coexistence. The presence of another, lightly marked, never intrusive, was part of this counsel, a reminder that solitude and companionship need not be opposed, but could exist in delicate balance. Days passed in this quiet rhythm. He continued to hunt, gather, and maintain his shelters, yet he did so with an awareness sharpened by the forest's counsel. His steps became lighter, his attention more acute. He began to notice signs of seasonal change with an almost spiritual precision, the first blooming of northern orchids, the faint tremble of birch leaves under a subtle wind, the emergence of insects from the thawing earth. All of these were threads in the vast tapestry he now inhabited, each requiring observation, care, and respect. And the unseen companion remained, a constant yet subtle presence that threaded through his awareness. Tracks would appear in snow-melt patches, small fires would burn briefly and then vanish, and carefully arranged stones would hint at a mind moving in parallel to his own. He never sought to confront, communicate, or claim this other for friendship. Instead, he allowed their existence to integrate naturally, a quiet reflection of his own discipline, patience, and understanding. The forest, in its infinite wisdom, had orchestrated this encounter not to disrupt him, but to teach the delicate art of coexistence. By the end of summer, the Northman had come to a profound realization. The forest council was not a single voice, nor a predictable lesson, but a complex and ongoing dialogue. Every rustle, every shadow, every subtle imprint carried meaning, demanding observation, interpretation, and reverence. The life he had chosen, 40 winters ago, was far from simple, yet it had revealed itself as a rich, intricate journey in which survival, patience, and subtle communion with the world intertwined seamlessly. And as the sun began its slow descent toward autumn, casting long, golden shadows across moss and stone, the Northman understood that his solitude, guided by the forest and mirrored in the quiet presence of another, was no longer merely an act of withdrawal. It was a life shaped by subtle understanding, by the patient accumulation of knowledge, and by a quiet harmony with forces far greater than himself. In this council, he found not just endurance, but a deeper form of existence, one that would carry him through the long, waiting winters yet to come. And as the first chill of approaching autumn whispered through the leaves, the Northman sensed that a new challenge loomed, one not of survival, nor solitude, nor observation, but of courage and trust, a test that would push the limits of 40 winters of patient existence. Autumn descended upon the northern forest with a quiet authority. The trees shed their leaves in slow, deliberate cascades, and the wind carried the faint, crisp scent of frost yet to come. For decades, the Northman had measured time by such subtle shifts, the bending of branches under early snow, the migration of birds, the swelling of rivers, and now he observed how the forest's slow transformation hinted at the passage of years, the relentless march of seasons, and the quiet inevitability of change. Amidst this shifting landscape, the presence he had long felt took on new significance. For weeks, he had glimpsed faint signs, tracks that diverged and converged, carefully arranged stones, smoke that drifted briefly and vanished. But now, the forest seemed to whisper insistently that he could no longer merely observe. The subtle intelligence moving alongside him demanded recognition, a quiet engagement that required courage tempered by patience. The first encounter occurred near a ridge overlooking a partially frozen river. He noticed a small fire burning in a sheltered hollow, its smoke curling gently into the crisp air. And as he approached cautiously, he saw the figure for the first time in full, a man, similarly attired in furs, crouching beside the flames, eyes reflecting both caution and curiosity. Neither spoke. Words, after so many years of solitary existence, would have been clumsy, disruptive. Instead, they regarded one another with the unspoken understanding that had been rehearsed in countless silent observations. The Northman felt a strange stir of apprehension, mingled with anticipation. Trust had always been a rare commodity in his life. He had trusted the forest to provide guidance, the seasons to offer consistency, and his own judgment to sustain him through storms and scarcity. But trust in another human, even one so subtly attuned to the rhythm of the woods, was a new and delicate challenge. Every instinct urged caution. Every muscle reminded him of the harsh lessons learned over 40 winters of careful survival. Days turned into weeks as the forest became a shared space. The two men moved in parallel, rarely meeting, yet aware of one another's presence in a manner both respectful and deliberate. Occasionally, their paths would cross at streams or hidden clearings, where a nod, a shift of gaze, or the careful placement of a stone became the language of their interaction. In this quiet negotiation, the Northman realized that trust was not demonstrated through words, nor gestures, nor even shared tasks. It was expressed through restraint, awareness, and patience. One evening, as twilight bathed the forest in amber light, a sudden storm rolled in. Snow fell in sheets, gusts of wind tearing at trees and flinging icy spray across frozen rivers. The Northman observed the other figure struggling with a makeshift shelter, its roof threatened by the relentless force of the blizzard. Instinct urged him to intervene, to offer aid as he would have for any creature in need. Yet he paused, recalling the forest's lessons. Trust is built slowly, nurtured carefully, and respected above all else. After a moment's consideration, he approached silently, placing a reinforcing branch without drawing attention, a subtle gesture of assistance without intrusion. The act was received not with words, but with understanding. A nod, a slight shift in posture, and the storm continued its course. In that fleeting exchange, the Northman felt the profound weight of trust, the realization that connection need not be intrusive to be meaningful, that the presence of another could be acknowledged with subtlety, and that the forest itself had guided him to this moment of careful engagement. As autumn deepened, the two men continued their quiet coexistence. They did not speak, they did not share meals, and yet a profound rhythm developed, a dance of observation, patience, and mutual respect. The Northman recognized that this subtle companionship was as demanding as any storm or blizzard he had endured. It required attentiveness, humility, and the courage to respect boundaries while acknowledging presence. Through the test of trust, the Northman discovered that solitude was not the absence of others, but the ability to engage with them without disrupting the delicate balance of one's own life. The forest, ever patient and instructive, had guided him to this understanding, that coexistence, like survival, demands both observation and restraint, attentiveness and courage, patience and subtlety. And as the first snow hinted at the coming winter, he felt the quiet certainty that this lesson would endure far beyond the season. Trust, once considered unnecessary in 40 years of isolation, had become a foundation upon which the final chapters of his life in the wilderness would be written, a subtle, enduring connection that required no words, only respect, patience, and the careful dance of shared solitude. And as the northern winds began to herald the approach of winter once more, the Northman understood that the forest had prepared him not only for survival, but for the most delicate of human experiences, the quiet, patient communion with another soul, amidst the vast and timeless wilderness. Winter arrived with the quiet inevitability that had long been the Northman's constant companion. Snow blanketed the forest in pristine silence, and the air hung heavy with the scent of frost and pine. The rivers, now fully frozen, reflected the pale light of the northern sky, and the woods, so familiar after decades of careful observation, seemed to exhale a slow, deliberate breath. It was a winter like no other, not in its severity, but in its culmination, a quiet punctuation marking 40 years of solitude, endurance, and communion with the land. The Northman moved with a confidence born of decades in the wilderness, his body attuned to the subtle rhythms of snow, ice, and wind. Each step was deliberate, each action measured against the lessons of seasons past. He tended his fire with the same meticulous care as when he had first arrived in this untamed expanse, yet now every spark, every curl of smoke, carried the weight of a lifetime. 40 winters had tempered him, shaped him, and revealed the profound simplicity of existence stripped to its essentials: survival, observation, patience, and the quiet joy of being entirely present in a world that required no human acknowledgement. He paused at the edge of a frozen river, tracing the familiar curves of ice and snow. Memories of the earliest days rose gently, unbidden: the first winter snowstorm, the hidden passage, the subtle presence of another wandering soul in the forest. Each memory was a thread, weaving together the tapestry of decades spent in the wilderness. And as he traced the patterns in the frost, he felt the full magnitude of the forest's gift: the cultivation of patience, the mastery of solitude, and the delicate understanding of trust. The unseen companion, the figure whose subtle presence had threaded through recent seasons, remained near yet unseen. Their existence was no longer a source of uncertainty but of quiet affirmation, a reflection of the Northmen's own discipline, a silent acknowledgment of mutual respect. They had shared the forest without intrusion, coexisted without conversation, and in doing so, taught the Northmen that connection need not disrupt solitude. It could enhance it, like a delicate note woven into the symphony of the woods. Even as the cold pressed against his shelters and frost clung to every branch, the Northman recognized that he had become more than a survivor. He was a part of the forest's intricate rhythm, his existence interwoven with the seasons, the animals, the streams, and the subtle movements of wind and snow. Every tree, every frozen stream, every hidden passage carried his touch, his careful observation, and his respect. The wilderness had transformed him, and he, in turn, had honored it through 40 winters of patient endurance. He walked slowly through the forest, breathing in the cold, crystalline air. The tracks he left behind were fleeting, soon swallowed by drifting snow, yet he felt no need for permanence. In 40 years, he had learned that life was measured not in monuments or memory, but in the subtle attentiveness to the present, the way the wind whispered through branches, the way rivers reflected light, the way shadows shifted across the forest floor. In this, he found the quiet satisfaction that sustained him more fully than any human company ever could. The final lesson of these winters was the understanding of time itself, that it flows not only in seasons and years, but in the careful accumulation of small acts, in observation and restraint, in endurance and reflection. He had witnessed the forest's slow choreography, the interplay of life and death, frost and thaw, predator and prey. And through it all, he had remained patient, watchful, and utterly attuned to the vast, breathing world around him. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the frozen ground, the Northman paused beside his fire. He watched the smoke rise, curling in intricate spirals into the crisp air, carrying with it the story of a life measured in quiet endurance rather than words, in observation rather than conversation, in harmony rather than conquest. 40 winters had passed, each one a teacher, each one a quiet affirmation of resilience, patience, and the enduring rhythm of the northern wilderness. And so he stood, alone yet not lonely, a figure shaped by snow and storm, by shadow and silence, by the subtle companionship of another, and the unyielding counsel of the forest itself. The wilderness had taught him everything a man could hope to learn, the art of survival, the mastery of solitude, the delicate negotiation of trust, and the profound serenity of being wholly present in a world that was at once vast, silent, and eternal. The 40 winters were complete. And in their quiet, measured conclusion, the Northman understood that he had achieved something few could ever comprehend, a life in perfect balance with the untamed world, a communion of spirit with the forest, and a patient endurance that would resonate, silently, for all the seasons yet to come. And so the forest whispered on, indifferent yet attentive, carrying the story of a man who walked its shadows, endured its winters, and learned the secret rhythm of solitude, leaving behind nothing but the soft imprint of 40 winters lived entirely in harmony with the wild.